Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be talking about Rook, the hungering berserker, and so sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Rook is a melee DPS champion who excels in getting close to enemies and dealing damage to them while berserk. He has various control options to control the battlefield and his enemies with, and he also has the ability to do some decent damage from afar as well. This is important since he can do at least something when he's not able to melee enemies in close range. In terms of survival, Rook has access to various survival or defensive options to keep himself alive in fights, so this is definitely a plus. While he may not be the strongest of champions right now, he can be quite fun to play because of his playstyle, and so I would recommend trying him out if you just want to relax and have some fun in Battlerite. In terms of his difficulty, I think that his skill set is quite beginner friendly since most of his abilities are quite straightforward. However, there are some little intricacies to them that more experienced players can make use of to make the most out of the champion. And so Rook is quite a well-rounded champion, I would say. Before we start, just like the other champion guides I have made previously for Rook and older, to name a few, I have split this guide up into different sections and have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below. As usual, feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you've already watched the video before. And again, we'll start the guide off with looking at Rook's abilities, before talking about his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Then we'll look at his Battlerites options, and finally we finish off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos when using Rook. And so without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about his abilities. Rook's left click or mouse 1 ability is Pummel, and this is his basic melee attack that deals 10 damage for each hit. In addition to that, each successful hit of Rook's mouse 1 ability reduces the cooldown of his mouse 2 ability by 0.5 seconds, making it so that you can cast his mouse 2 more often. Pretty cool. Next up, Rook's right click or mouse 2 ability is Crushing Blow, and what the ability does is that Rook will jump in the air, avoiding all damage and effects during this time before slamming his mace into the ground on the targeted area next to him. Enemies caught in the area is dealt some damage, and the armor break debuff is also put on them for 3 seconds. During these 3 seconds, the target takes 20% more damage from attacks, and so this is a good way of starting off a series of attacks on an enemy since they will take more damage from Rook as well as Rook's teammates. Because the ability has an inherent invincibility frame, experienced players can take advantage of this to avoid many different abilities, making it very useful as a pseudo survivor ability as well. Very nice. It is definitely worth it to use it to avoid an ability if needed, I think, so don't worry about wasting its damage or something if in case you don't hit anything with it. Rook's spacebar ability is Rush, and it is basically his main gap closer ability. What it does is that Rook will charge forward, and if he hits an enemy, the target will be dealt some damage depending on the distance charged, and he will also be stunned for a short duration. Because of the increased damage based on distance for the charge, the ability becomes a very good initiation ability since it not only gets you close, but it also deals more damage if you charge very far. Naturally, enemies with an escape cooldown ready or are aware that you are trying to charge are likely to be able to dodge it somehow, and so it might be quite hard to land the ability. What you could do though is to try to bait out their escapes or something by cancelling the charge at the last second before you try to actually charge them for real the second time. This only sometimes works against more experienced players, but it is still worth a try I suppose. Moving on, Rook's Q ability is Berserk, and this is his counter ability. What the ability does is that Rook will enter a trance state for a short while, and during this time, any melee attack or projectile will trigger the counter effect, giving Rook his Berserk buff. The Berserk buff gives him a massive movement and attack speed boost, allowing him to dish out massive amounts of damage to nearby enemies with his basic attacks. This buff lasts for 3 seconds, so enemies will typically try to jump away or something if they trigger the counter, or else they would take a lot of damage. In addition to that, Rook will actually be invulnerable for 1 second after the trigger, allowing him to tank through some damage during that time, so that's pretty cool. Berserk is actually a key to Rook's damage because his damage output isn't very high without it. Depending on your Battlerites picks, you might need to rely on Rook's Q to give you the Berserk buff to deal damage, and so definitely practice timing your Q to trigger from enemy attacks for maximum Berserk uptime. Just be careful of AoE abilities since those abilities go through the counter and will not trigger it. Next up, Rook's E ability is Boulder Toss, and this is his main long range poke ability. What it does is Rook throws a boulder at the targeted area, and when it lands, it deals a decent amount of damage and knocks enemy back away from the center of the impact. The ability is very useful not only as a damage ability, but as a control ability since you can try to knock enemies into unfavorable positions or even knock the orb toward your team if you want to. Furthermore, it can be used as a zoning tool as well since enemies wouldn't usually voluntarily walk into the AoE of the ability. So that's about it for Rook's abilities that doesn't require energy. Now let us look at those which do. Starting with Rook's R ability, Smack. This ability is Rook's hard CC ability. What it does is that Rook will smack enemies in a wide arc in front of him, dealing damage while knocking back all enemies hit in the direction of the mouse when the ability was activated. Enemies knocked into a wall will be incapacitated for 2.5 seconds, allowing Rook or his teammates to easily land skill shots for a while. Very useful. The smack arc is very big, and the knockback also knocks the enemy back quite a distance, so just test it out for yourself and get a good feel of it to reliably incapacitate enemies. Moving on, Rook's first EX ability is his Shift Mouse 1 ability, Eat. This ability costs 25 energy and it is basically just a self-heal. This is Rook's main sustain ability and it basically just heals Rook for some health, followed by even more health over a few seconds. Very simple. The ability is definitely very handy in a pinch, as well as 1v1 situations, since it is a good source of healing for just a little bit of energy. Next up, Rook's second EX ability is his Shift Right Click ability, Meat Bolt. The ability costs 25 energy, and what it does is Rook will throw his meat a certain distance, and it will deal quite a large amount of damage and inflict the snare on the enemy that it hit. Because it costs energy to use, the ability isn't that great for poking even though it has decent range. Furthermore, the base Mouse 2 ability has an iframe tied to it in addition to the good burst AoE damage and debuff that comes with it as well. These factors make it hard to justify using Meat Bolt, but it does have one very good use, and that is to finish enemies off. It is the best ability in Rook's kit to finish off enemies since it is a direct projectile attack, unlike Rook's E, which takes a while to land. Finally, Rook's ultimate ability on the F key is Tremor. It costs all of Rook's energy, and basically what Rook does when he activates his ultimate ability is that he'll jump into the air before slamming his hammer down into the ground to deal damage in a long line in front of him. Rook will do this ability 3 times before the ability ends, and while jumping, Rook is immune to damage, but when he's on the ground for a while to do the attack, he can be stunned, damaged and all of that stuff, so enemies who can time their attacks well can still do something to you if they wish. Do note that the damage from each strike increases, with the last strike doing 50% more than the first strike, and so if you're able to get your teammates to immobilize enemies within the range of Rook's ultimate, they're going to get hit for a lot of damage. Hitting all 3 strikes give a total of 90 damage. Very powerful indeed. Depending on the matchups, you may or may not have enough energy to use the ultimate ability, since you might need to use most of your energy on healing yourself with the EX Mouse 1 ability if you don't have a support teammate. It is inevitable that you receive some damage when playing as Rook, and so using the EX Mouse 1 to heal is quite crucial for sustaining Rook's health bar. But when he can get enough energy to use his ultimate though, I'd say it is pretty worth it at the right moments, because getting even 2 hits off is very worth it already, in my opinion at least. And so that's about it for Rook's abilities. Now let us move on to his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Rook's playstyle is a bit of an aggressive one. He really has to keep trying to get close to his enemies and time his Q or counter ability properly to really allow him to deal meaningful damage. After charging in and dealing as much damage as he can, he'll then have to wait for his cooldowns a little bit before trying to do that again. When playing as Rook, you'll typically use your E to poke a little bit here and there while waiting for a chance to charge in with his spacebar ability. Hitting Rook's spacebar onto an enemy usually at least guarantees at least one basic mouse 1 hit, or you can usually start off with a mouse 2 right on top of the enemy if you think that you wouldn't need to save it to avoid some big ability in the near future. At this point, if you think they're going to hit back instead of jump away, then using his Q would be a good choice to try to get that berserk buff so that you can dish out more damage. This will be a typical game plan when trying to go on the offensive, and when you're not trying to go on the offensive, then you can just maybe heal up with Rook's EX Mouse 1 or something and wait for more opportunities to be offensive. Even though Rook has pretty good sustain in his EX Mouse 1, he does need energy for it and they don't come free. So definitely try to take every opportunity you can get to be aggressive and apply some pressure on the enemy. Another way to engage if you don't want to use your spacebar is to position yourself very far forward and just try to be a bait. Time your Q properly and you can use that 1 second of invulnerability to charge an enemy. You should try to do this if you think the enemy has an escape cooldown ready, since if you do this, you can now use your spacebar ability to catch up to them after they have jumped. After you realize you've run out of steam and cannot deal too much damage anymore, you can try to incapacitate an enemy with your R ability if there's a wall nearby. During this time, your E should be off cooldown and you can easily get in some free damage this way. If the situation allows for it, you can even press on the attack. Otherwise, just take it slow for a bit, recharge your cooldowns and try to find chances to be aggressive again. That's pretty much it actually for Rook's playstyle, very straightforward and simple, and that's why he's quite beginner friendly. Admittedly, it might be tough to avoid damage as melee, and you always have to weigh up the costs of charging in and all that, but at least the general playstyle of the champion is simple enough that more energy can be spent thinking about positioning, managing your health bar and all that, instead of figuring out how you want to best use your abilities as Rook. Moving on to Rook's strengths, I think one of his strengths is his ability to sustain himself directly. Many other champions' sustainability comes from having to hit the enemy to begin with, and therefore this can make it a bit inconsistent for them to heal themselves. Rook's heal, however, is immediate and simple to use as long as you have energy, and so this makes him super good at surviving and lasting in a 1 vs 1 fight. Next up, I think that another one of Rook's strength is his ability to do decent AoE damage. His mouse 2, E, R, and ultimate abilities all do very good area of effect damage, and so if all the enemies are grouped together in tight corners, Rook can easily deal massive amounts of damage to them, since such a large portion of his skill set can do AoE damage. What this essentially means is that if you and your team can apply enough pressure to force them into tighter spaces, you have that much of an easier time winning that round as Rook. Finally, I think that Rook is also very strong against champions that have a long build up. Certain champions rely on weapon charges or a certain amount of energy to function decently, and so they are particularly weak at the start of the round, where they have access to neither of them at the time. Rook, having no need of either of that to dish out good damage, can take advantage of the fact and try to apply lots of pressure onto these champions right from the start. If you manage to do enough damage, it is often hard for said champion to come back if you play the rest of the round right, and so it is often a good move to apply lots of early pressure on those champions if you can. So those were Rook's strengths. Now let us talk about some of his weaknesses. First off, I think that one of Rook's weaknesses is how easy it is for him to be kited. Outside of his spacebar, he has no reliable way of closing the gap between him and some ranged champions. Getting his champions to trigger his counter is one way of getting a short speed boost to rush toward the enemy, but it does rely on your enemy making a mistake, so it can be inconsistent. Some champions have more than one escape ability, and so it can often be frustrating to use spacebar to rush at them, only for them to jump away. You are then forced to wait for your spacebar to cool down before you can try to get closer again, unless you could get them to hit your counter somehow. Moving on, another one of Rook's weakness is that because of how simple he is as a champion, most Rooks only have one playstyle, and so it can be quite easy to predict what Rooks are trying to do. In a game like Battlerites, you're in a massive disadvantage if you are predictable, and so it can be tough sometimes to be unpredictable with a champion that is so simple, since his abilities all have one or at most two functions. And so sometimes, even though we are trying to be aggressive to maintain the pressure on an enemy, we also need to be patient and wait for better opportunities to avoid taking too much damage as well. Finally, I think that Rook's biggest weakness is his reliance on berserk for damage. There's a big difference between the damage output of Rook while berserked and while he is not berserked, and that's why I think that this is his biggest weakness. His damage output is really inconsistent because of this. The only way for him to get that buff in his base kit is by getting an enemy to trigger his counter, which is often unreliable since it depends on your enemy making a mistake. Luckily or unluckily, depending on how you look at it, Rook can correct this by choosing certain Battlerites which should make his damage more consistent. I say that it could be an unlucky thing because it makes it so that certain Battlerites almost feel like it's a must pick, and so there isn't much choice in terms of Battlerites for some rounds. And so that's about it for his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Now let us move on to Rook's Battlerites options. Once again, you can pause the video to slowly read through every single Battlerites if you wish before I go through my thoughts on his Battlerites, since it will take a long while for me to read it all out for you. And so pause now to read them all. Okay, now that you've read them all, let's continue. In the first tier, I think that it is mostly a choice between Raging Bull and Squash. I feel that Giant isn't exactly that worth it because most of the time when you're berserk, the enemy will probably jump away because they want to avoid getting hit by you and wouldn't even bother trying to hit you. The extra 1 second berserk might help, but if the enemies always jump away when they can, then it wouldn't count for much anyways. Between Raging Bull and Squash, I think Squash would be the pick most of the time. Sometimes, against enemies that are very mobile, Raging Bull can be a good choice since you'll have 2 charges of your spacebar ability. Against most other enemies, the stun on your mouse 2 is quite good for setting up combos or just simply disrupting the enemy's flow and all that, so pretty sweet I would say. It also helps you to get like 1 or 2 more hits on an enemy if you manage to stun them, so that's like a bonus as well. In short, pick Squash most of the time and Raging Bull when you need the extra charge. On to the second tier, I think it will likely be Frenzy most of the time. Frenzy is the most reliable way for you to get the Berserk buff since you're in direct control of it. This helps Rook tremendously in the damage department since he can charge in and proceed to get a few hits in onto an enemy before they jump away or something. Very good. Even though Frenzy is quite a bit better than the other 2 choices, depending on the matchups, Crag and Weapon Break aren't bad choices as well. Weapon Break is a pretty good way to make your enemies deal less damage to you, in particular melee champions, since they are the most susceptible to getting hit by Rook's mouse 2, and they may continue fighting you. But other than that, it probably doesn't have much use. It is definitely a decent pick if your team is not fully reliant on Rook to deal damage, since Frenzy just gives so much more damage potential. Against multiple ranged enemies with a lot of mobility, Crag can sometimes be a good pick as well since it gives you that much more poke potential. Having said that though, again, if Rook is expected to dish out a lot of damage, maybe because he's the only DPS in the team, then Frenzy is often still the better pick. By hook or by crook, Rook will have to land those charges and try to burst enemies down. On to the third tier, all three Battlerites picks are actually quite solid. If you're using his E ability a lot to poke, perhaps because the enemies are mainly ranged, then Crumble is a good choice. The armor break debuff is good as well for some added bonus damage from both Rook or his teammates, so very nice I would say. If you're looking for more control, maybe the enemies are very good at turtling and you're trying to force the fight into a 2 vs 1, then Slugger is definitely a good pick for more and longer incapacitates. Outside of those situations, Madness is a good all-around pick since some extra movement speed is always nice when you're trying to chase and burst someone down. Moving on, in the fourth tier, I think that Pummel Rush is probably the pick most of the time. Warcry and Recuperate are good too, but in general, Pummel Rush will probably give the most value since it allows you to charge more often, essentially making you able to chase down enemies and deal more damage more often. If you're struggling to avoid damage and staying alive, then taking Recuperate is also okay. Just make sure you have a support teammate to heal you though, since taking Recuperate just for the extra healing on your EX Moss ones isn't good enough I feel. Warcry can be a decent pick, but I feel it is quite niche. Most of the time, you outrun most enemies already just with the default berserk buff, and so you hardly need enemies to be slowed for you to deal damage. What it may be more useful for is it slowing enemies down for your teammates to attack them since they'll have an easier time aiming their shots etc. Also, Warcry is also probably more useful against melee enemies I feel. This is because when you cast Chyill, you will typically time it just as an attack is about to hit, and since ranged enemies are usually too far away for the Warcry effect to hit them when you try to counter their ranged attacks, it probably wouldn't do much against them as compared to melee enemies who would probably be near to you to attack you. So yeah, for this tier in most cases just get Pummel Rush. Finally, in the fifth and final tier, I think that both Seething Rage and Earthquake can be pretty good, with Earthquake being the better choice more often than not. Earthquake gives very good damage since it amplifies all damage by 20%. Effectively, your ultimate can deal up to a maximum of 108 damage with this right instead of the 90 without the right. If you factor in the increased damage that teammates do to your enemies affected by armor break, the total potential damage will be very high. Seething Rage on the other hand only takes effect if you fully finish casting his ultimate. Any interruption to the ability doesn't trigger the berserk buff, and so you can't even cancel it halfway just to make use of the ultimate as some free damage followed by a berserk. Having said that though, it definitely has some uses whereby you will have an easier time repositioning after finishing the channel, so that might be pretty good. It certainly comes down to your game plan and matchup I suppose. When in doubt though, just get Earthquake. And so yeah, that's about it on Rook's Battlerites. Now let us move on to some of my gameplay tips for playing Rook, as well as some potential combos with him. My first tip for playing Rook is to get used to hitting your charge or spacebar ability and get used to timing those counters. Being able to do these two things is crucial for Rook to deal good damage, and so it really helps if you can do these two things consistently. Practice your aim with the spacebar and try to sharpen your reaction time to proc those counters. Moving on, another tip I have for playing Rook is be patient and don't just keep rushing in. Rook is easily kited when he doesn't have his gap closers, and so he would just take too much damage in the process if he should try to run and chase down an enemy without a proper plan on how to get closer efficiently. Without the berserk buff, it is hard to deal good consistent damage with Rook, and so you shouldn't waste time trying to chase and hit an enemy. You should only try to attack this way when you know the enemy won't retaliate or kite you, and you can do it safely without taking too much damage. Next up, I would suggest familiarizing yourself with some of the combos that Rook can pull off. This would help a lot with dealing damage and controlling your enemies when you need to. Some useful combos include the E and charge combo. This combo is easier done on a stationary target, so perhaps you could incapacitate them first, or your teammate already petrified them or incapacitated them or something. So basically the combo just involves throwing the E on top of the enemy, and you proceed to charge toward where the enemy will end up after being knocked back by your E ability. This is a good 28 to 42 damage combo depending on how far away the enemy was to you when you charge, and it's also a good way to start off a series of attacks since the enemy is also stunned for a brief period from your spacebar ability. At this point, a mouse 1, mouse 2 with stun, mouse 1 followed by an R ability to the wall is a good combo to use as well if you haven't already used your R ability previously. Your teammate can then follow up with their own abilities too at this point since the enemy is incapacitated, so I would say it's a very nice combo indeed. On a moving target, you can forgo the E and just space onto them, followed by the mouse 1, mouse 2, mouse 1 and R combo I mentioned for some pretty good damage also. Bear in mind that enemies who are quick enough can use an escape ability at some point in the middle of this combo, so you may or may not be able to pull off the full combo. If possible, try to make them waste their escape first for maximum effect. About team compositions, I think that Rook goes very well with a strong ranged teammate. The ranged teammate can be a DPS or a support, and it shouldn't be that big of a deal. It is always nice to have some heals on the melee champion though, so I usually prefer a support teammate for some backup. The reason why you want your teammate to be a strong ranged champion, whether support or DPS, is so that you can provide cover for them as Rook, since Rook is pretty big and tanky, and this should let your teammate do what they do best. Furthermore, strong ranged champions have good zoning capabilities, and this makes it more likely for them to pressure enemies into corners, where Rook excels with his AoE attacks. I feel Rook doesn't do so well with melee teammates because it is very easy for teammates to body block each other. Because Rook relies on enemies hitting his counter to do meaningful damage, having teammates around Rook makes it that much harder to absorb those hits with his Q, and so Rook will lose out on a lot of potential damage. What's more, having a melee teammate blocking you while you're trying to run circles around your enemies while you hit them is also not really ideal, I would say. So yeah, I very much prefer having ranged teammates with Rook. Ha! And so overall, I think Rook is a good beginner champion to learn if you're trying to get into a melee playstyle. His abilities are simple but effective, and so it should be easy to pick up fairly quickly as long as you apply the right tactics for engaging. Even though he's not the strongest champion right now, and he can be fairly predictable at times, he is still pretty effective when played right, and can definitely do decently and hold his own against champions that counter him. By that I mean champions that can kite very well. And so yeah, that's about it for my Rook guide. I hope you found it useful. I've tallied up the polls on my now outdated Jumong guide, and it seems like a Freya guide will be up next. If you want to vote for which champion guide I would do next after Freya's guide, you can do so by clicking the I button at the top right now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel, like it, comment on it, share this video, and you can check out my other videos as well if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, keep gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.